Welcome to the Ask John Project, Week 2. Today we'll entertain questions from students from Lincoln High School in Oregon, North Glen High School in Colorado, Brunswick High School in Virginia, and Arcadia High School in California. John, out of all 64 items in the Magna Carta, which ones, in your view, were the most important to Americans?
Magna Carta listed probably over 60 different articles defending rights that Englishmen had at the time. It was not the origin of rights. The rights had already existed. It was merely a physical manifestation that these rights existed. And they came down throughout English history and then into the American scene with the colonists. And even after the Revolution, Americans look back to Magna Carta as sort of the founding document. It wasn't really, there were documents before then, but it was the one document that they could point to as the beginning of the written down rights. There were a number of provisions in the Magna Carta that they particularly liked, and the other provisions, they were either archaic and they didn't apply to the Americans, or the Americans, for whatever reason, didn't refer to them. And so the provisions of Magna Carta that were important, first of all, you have the concept of limited government. That's what Magna Carta was all about. The king could not just do whatever he wanted to do. There were certain limitations put upon the king from past experience. And so the Americans bought into that limited nature of government. But then there were three other specific provisions that were used. Americans were not above doing that. They often would rewrite history to fit into their particular political situation. And that's what they did over and over again with these particular rights that were manifested in the Magna Carta. So the first of these is that no one could be deprived of their lives, their freedom, and their property without a trial by jury of one's peers under the law of the land. And so those are particularly important words that are there: trial by jury of your peers and law of the land. And that comes up repeatedly in American documents, law of the land. It's not until the Constitution and the amendments in 1789 that we get sort of a transformation away from law of the land to due process. But law of the land is what we had from Magna Carta, and that's what Americans used throughout the colonial period. The second specific provision of Magna Carta was that no one could be taxed without his own approval or the approval of his immediate representatives. It wasn't written in exactly that language, but that's the gist of what it was. You had to give approval to taxation. The king couldn't tax on his own. And then finally, the last provision of Magna Carta that is referred to over and over again is that justice would be swift and could not be purchased or sold. And so you could reasonably expect that government would provide justice. That was the aim. The goal of government was to provide justice, and that would not be denied. And it was embodied in the Magna Carta and repeated over and over, decade after decade, new king after new king, and in the various documents that protected rights in colonial America.
Well, hopefully that will help Bob Benjamin from Arcadia sort out a few things about Magna Carta. I guess I have a follow-up to that. Are there any important documents that predate Magna Carta that are important for Americans? This comes from an anonymous question we received.
Certainly the English refer to events and documents that predate Magna Carta, particularly during the reign of Edward. There are protections for jury trials and speedy trials and habeas corpus protections. So there are a number of these protections, and you see these in some of the great documents in English history. where they're sort of footnoted as to where these come from. And they don't all come from Magna Carta. So there were documents that predated, documents and events that guaranteed rights that came before Magna Carta. For the most part, though, Americans don't cite those. They cite the English documents, and sort of the first of those English documents is Magna Carta.
It's often been said that many of the constitutional struggles of the 17th century were over royal prerogatives. Would you agree, or is that an oversimplification about the 1600s?
No, I would certainly agree with that. The prerogatives of the king were tremendously important. And what prerogative, it's a wonderful word, and it's a word that you should all know and feel free to use and try to understand. And it's sort of hard for us to understand today because we don't have a branch of government that has those prerogatives necessarily. And in the case of the English here, the king had certain powers that were his to control just because he was the king. And they generally fell into four different areas. First was taxation. And one of the reasons for these prerogative powers is that the king could act quickly. And sometimes you needed that kind of quick action. One of the benefits of monarchy in a theoretical perspective, going back to Aristotle, would be the immediacy of action. And republics and democracies are slower to act. And so that's a detriment of that form of government. Naturally, if you act quickly, it could be tyrannical as well, and that's not so good. But the king had these prerogative powers because they were necessary to act quickly and necessary to get the realm defended. So the first area of four of prerogative powers was in taxation. The second general area dealt with the judiciary, the appointment and tenure of the judges. Judges were appointed by the king, and they served at the pleasure of the king. It wasn't until much later that you get the good behavior tenure. That doesn't come about until the Act of Succession in 1701. Also included with that judicial authority, you had the power over imprisonment. There were certain prerogative powers there that if you were in jail, if the king had you arrested, it was probably a good reason, and he didn't have to necessarily give those reasons. His prerogative power of having you arrested was good enough for most of the judges to keep you in jail for however long the king wanted you in jail. The third provision of the prerogative power would be to dispense and suspend law. This is a critical thing. Parliament, which most people think of Parliament as the House of Lords and the House of Commons, that's true, but Parliament has a third branch, and that's the king. So Parliament should be considered as the king in combined with the House of Lords and House of Commons. And they pass different laws, but the king has the authority to dispense or suspend those laws in critical situations. Now, what's the difference between the two? Dispense means for an individual, one individual. If the king wants to have a person appointed to an office, and let's say that person is a Catholic and is by law prohibited from serving in that capacity, the king could dispense with that law and appoint that one person. Now, the king could suspend laws for everybody. So this would be a much broader exercise of that prerogative power. So the king could either suspend a law totally or dispense with the law for individual cases. And then finally, the last area of prerogative power might be considered sort of housekeeping for the monarchy. And this would include things like the succession. It would include the education of royal children. And it would include the marriage of royal children, who the children would marry. Could these, who decides who would be the husbands and wives of royal children? The king prerogative gave him that authority. So those are the areas where the prerogative was very important. And the king wanted to exercise those powers. During the reigns of James I and Charles I, this is when Queen Elizabeth dies without an heir, and so they leave the Tudor family and they go to the Steward family. And James I is appointed king. He's 36 years old. He's known as the cradle king or the baby king. You might question, why is that? He's 36 years old. Well, he's been king of Scotland for 35 years. He was James VI of Scotland. Now he's going to be James I of England. And so he comes to the throne with an idea of the divine right of kings. And this is not what Englishmen like to think. It's maybe what Scottish people are thinking, but not the English at this time. And then his son, who succeeds him, Charles I, they both have problems with money. That's their main concern. The revenue is falling behind, and the expenses of government are going up, particularly the wars and the diplomacy necessary to carry on those wars on the continent. And so both kings have to use their prerogative power to raise money because they're not able to get as much money out of Parliament as they would like. And James is a pretty successful politician. He knows, he's adept. Charles is less so. Later, when the monarchy is eventually eliminated during the English Civil War, when it's restored in 1660, Charles II comes to the throne. He's the son of Charles I. And then when he dies, his brother, James II, assumes the throne. Both of those men wanted to reinvigorate the prerogative powers that had been lost during the English Civil War. And their concerns were much less with finances and much more concerned with religion and the animosity of most Englishmen to Catholics at the time and to dissenters to a certain extent. And so the fact that they were prohibited from holding office and voting and even meeting and holding their services, there were probably a dozen so laws that would substantially limit the freedom of Catholics and dissenters. And so the conflict between Parliament and the king, James I and Charles I, over taxation, and between Parliament and Charles II and James II over religion, what really drove the animosity between these different branches of government.
Just to clarify something, John, I think you were referencing the Act of Succession as a struggle between Parliament and the Crown. Did I hear you right on that?
No, I don't think it was an act of conflict between the two, because the conflict between king and Parliament had pretty well been settled in 1689 with the Glorious Revolution. And so there's no doubt at this particular time Parliament is supreme and the king is limited. And at first the king and queen, William and Mary. But when Mary dies and then William dies, Anne comes to the throne. She's the queen, and she gets pregnant multiple times, but always miscarries, and so there's no logical heir. And so Parliament, as well as the queen, decide that there has to be some kind of a law that would guide the succession. And they provide that there is this sequence of events, sequence of individuals setting up this line of succession that would exclude the Catholics. And so, in fact, when Anne dies without heir, they have to pass over 30 individuals who are in that line of succession, but they're all Catholics. And so the English would prefer to have a German king, George I, the Hanoverian kings, who happens to be Protestant rather than a Catholic Englishman as their king. And so we get a major shift there. The Act of Succession also provides for the first time, and this is I think what I mentioned before, the first time that the tenure of judges is expressed as good behavior, as opposed to previously the judges had served during the pleasure of the king. That was the understanding. Judges would serve with good pleasure under William and Mary. But it wasn't specified any place, and it wasn't always upheld. So that when they decided on the Act of Succession, they did put in that tenure of office for judges. It's interesting to see that that's only in England. It's not in the American colonies. So although the American colonists wanted to have their judges appointed with good behavior tenure, that was never the case. They always advocated that. And furthermore, another thing that passed that was different with judges is that no longer were judges tied, as long as you have good behavior, they were not tied directly to the monarch. Whereas it used to be the case in England, and it was always the case in America, that when the king died, the judges lost their commissions, and they had to get recommissioned by the new monarch. That wasn't going to be the case in England, given the good behavior tenure in the Act of Succession.
We had several questions about the Habeas Corpus Act, and perhaps Mariah of North Glen put it best. She wants to know, should it be considered as an important act as some of the others that you've talked about? Why would colonials have been so attuned to that law?
Some folks, both contemporaries living in the 16th and 17th century, 18th century, and historians today, believe that the single most important right that an individual might have is the right of the writ of habeas corpus. And the argument in favor of that interpretation is that this is the right that protects you from imprisonment, arbitrary imprisonment. And as long as a ruler can't put you in jail and abandon you there, leave you to an anonymous existence in prison, you have a chance. Your rights have a chance to surface. And so habeas corpus is very important. And that's what habeas corpus means, that the body must be brought forward before the judges. And so habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus, the protection of the writ of habeas corpus goes way back in English history, a couple centuries before the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. Habeas corpus is one of the major issues in the famous Five Knights case in 1627. Charles I had provided for a forced loan. If you didn't pay the forced loan, which was in essence a tax, if you were a commoner, you were impressed into the military service. If you were a peer, if you were a lord, you'd be arrested and put in jail. And that's what happened. Over 100 peers were put in jail under Charles I. 5 of these came to trial. They got lawyers and they were brought forward and with a writ of habeas corpus. And the king was to explain, why are these people in jail and not being tried? They were just languishing there. The court, which is in the back pocket of the crown, rules that the king must have had good reason for this, and that it was fine, that these people were not given a trial. And so this was an example of the judges and courts ruling in favor, tyrannically in favor of the king. And so that gave rise to the Petition of Right in 1628. And very few rights are mentioned in the Petition of Right. One of those, however, is against this arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, and advocated that the old right of the writ of habeas corpus should be resurfaced and should be there as a protection. The king agreed to that in 1628, but when Parliament was dissolved, the king said, no, I really didn't, I wasn't serious in that, and therefore I didn't give my approval to it. And so periodically you had the writ of habeas corpus not being upheld. One official after another, whether it be a government official under the crown, a prison official, or whether it be a judge, would violate the writ of habeas corpus. And eventually what happened was in 1679, there is this act which is noted as one of the great acts in English history defending rights, the Habeas Corpus Act. It's a very long act. And Leonard Levy, one of the great historians, American historians of the Bill of Rights, said it's a deadly dull and tiresome act to have to go through the whole thing. And it probably, in big pages, would take up almost 10 pages. It covers virtually every single possible abridgment of the writ of habeas corpus. But Leonard Levy, in his Encyclopedia of the American Constitution, which is a great collection, 4 volumes and a 5th supplemental volume, he describes the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 very simply. It closed all the loopholes. It made it virtually impossible not to provide for the writ of habeas corpus. And so that's why that act is so important. And it becomes important in American history that this is a right that Americans value quite a bit, and it's put into the body of the Constitution. It's specified that the writ of habeas corpus cannot be denied, can only be suspended by Congress in cases of invasion or armed rebellion. And so the ancestor of that constitutional provision is the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679.
We have a question from Roger from Arcadia. I'm going to modify it slightly, but essentially, what is the basic difference between the Petition of Right in the earlier 1600s and the English Bill of Rights later?
They're both the same as to what is it that they cover. And that is when the English have their great documents, the 2 that you mentioned, the Petition of Right, 1628, the Bill of Rights, first declaration, 1688, and then actually a bill that becomes an act, 1689. It's the same as Magna Carta, 1215. These are documents that list rights that the king has violated. And what Parliament is saying by passing these acts is if you continue to violate our rights, these rights that you have already violated, if you don't stop by doing these violations, we won't support you. We won't support you financially. We won't support you in other ways. And so that's what these 2 documents, the Petition of Right in 1628, basically says to Charles I, stop the arbitrary arrests, stop the illegal use of prerogative powers in taxing us without our approval, stop the denial of habeas corpus, and there are a few other rights that are protected, but very few. There might be no more than a half dozen rights that are protected, and the king goes along with that as long as Parliament is in session. The king then later on says, no, I didn't really mean to give official sanction to it. Now, the Bill of Rights, on the other hand, the Declaration of Rights, is much longer. There are many, many rights that James II has violated, and they're all listed. I mean, this is a different kind of thing from the Americans. The Americans, they peremptory list rights, even before their official, whether it be the king or their governors, have violated the rights. These are listed as these are rights that we have, and don't violate them in the future. But not so in England. The rights have to be violated first, and they were violated, and so over and over again in the English Bill of Rights, you don't have just the 6 rights that were violated and protected in the Petition of Right, but you probably have 40 or more rights that are protected in the English Bill of Rights. One of which is sort of interesting because it sheds a little bit of light on the right to bear arms. one of the rights that James II violated was he allowed Catholics to bear arms. And so you can infer from that it wasn't illegal for non-Catholics to bear arms. It was illegal for Catholics to bear arms. And so these were things that were just listed and in this wonderful document. And the King, James II, was not given the chance to say, I'm in favor of this. The King was fighting for his throne and was defeated, and William and Mary were invited to come and take over the crown of England. And before they were allowed, before they were given that position of the new monarchs, they had to agree to the English Bill of Rights. So all those rights that James had violated, William and Mary said they would not violate. So they were going to be protected under the reign of this new monarchy.
An often overlooked event in British colonial history is this Parliament's attempt to create the Dominion of New England. What's so important about that effort on Parliament's part, and what was the colonial response to that effort?
After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, most of the American colonies are established. Actually, Pennsylvania is the last of the 12 colonies to be established, in the 1680s, 1682. The 13th colony, Georgia, is not established until 1732. And so throughout the reign of the Steward kings, starting in the Stewards take over in 1603 with James I and serve through 1689 with James II. But during that 80-some year period of time, the 12 mainland North American colonies are established. And some of them all of them have charters, some of them are royal charters. But now when the revolution, the Civil War is over, the Civil War going from about 1642 until 1660, Cromwell is serving as sort of a tyrant in the Commonwealth period. No monarchy and no House of Lords, but there is a revulsion at what Cromwell had done. He had led the New Model Army against Charles I and was successful. Didn't take long for him to be named Lord Protector, and he ruled with an iron fist, so that when he died, people were happy that he died, and many people wanted to reestablish the monarchy. There was a year and a half of conflict between Richard Cromwell, the son of Oliver Cromwell, and he's defeated, and then Charles II is invited to come back from his exile in France. He sees the situation that has developed with the American colonies and doesn't particularly care for it. It's fairly expensive to administer. There's a great deal of decentralization. There's a lack of control and a lack of revenue, and it appears more and more as if the colonies, at least the northern colonies, are not primarily there for the benefit of the imperial government. And they're starting to become sort of independent on their own, not just politically, but also economically. And they're trading with more other countries, and they're starting to have more manufacturers. They don't have the stable crops that the southern colonies have. And so there's an attempt on the part of Charles II and his advisors to get control, centralized control of the northern colonies. And so this would be really from Pennsylvania north to including New Hampshire. The colonies don't like this. They like their decentralization. They don't like the king's interference and Parliament's interference, and they don't like the interference of the other colonies. They like being decentralized, and in fact, this decentralization is an important factor on thrusting rights upon the colonists. That is, the security of the colonies and the financial prosperity of the colonies are often based upon increased population. And the way to get increased population is to offer more incentives to immigrants coming in. And those incentives are land, obviously, land ownership, and also rights. And so the proprietors and the colonists themselves are very willing to offer rights to individuals coming in. Well, the king is not so concerned about these rights, and so he wants to reduce the cost of administration, increase the supervision, the benign neglect that we talked about last time, that the colonies were pretty much on their own. That should stop, and so the Parliament passes a number of navigation acts that try to control the commerce, and there is a limited amount of taxation involved in that, not so much for revenue, but for the direction of commerce and where it will go. And so this attempt at the Dominion of New England is an attempt at centralization. Charters are done away with, which the Americans don't care for. These are in essence, their colonial constitutions. Rights are limited. Taxing is centralized and increased. All these things Americans are not in favor of, so they object to these things. And when the governors come over, Governor Dudley at first, but then replaced by Governor Andros, they're ruling with a heavy hand. This is particularly true after Charles II dies and James II takes the throne. James II had been under his brother, the Duke of York, when New Amsterdam, under the control of the Dutch, is finally conquered by the English. It's named New York, and the governor, the new administrator, is going to be James, Duke of York, who will become king. And he is not one of these proprietors that want to give rights to individuals. He wants to rule with a heavy hand. And so the New Yorkers have difficulty guaranteeing their rights. And so James, during his tenure, when the Dominion of New England is in full swing now, he wants to advocate this centralization, this control, this taxation, all of which the American colonists object to. When the Glorious Revolution takes place and James II is overthrown, it doesn't take long for Edmund Andros, the governor of the Dominion of New England, to be booted out of office, sent back to England. He's put on trial there, and the colonists receive new charters from William and Mary. And so the Dominion of New England is no longer. It's interesting to see that when Benjamin Franklin, if we fast forward now to 1754, he proposes the Albany Plan of Union, which to a certain extent would duplicate what the Stewards, Charles and James II, both of them, wanted to do, centralization. Franklin wanted to do that primarily for administration and protection against the French and the Indians. Both the colonists and the royal government object to that. They see danger in that kind of unification. The colonists want their decentralization, and the crown sees that these colonies are too strong now, and they have a tough enough time controlling the individual colonies rather than a unified group of colonists. So the Albany Plan is unsuccessful from both an imperial perspective and a individual colony perspective.
Let's move on to the first bullet point of this week's agenda. Jeff from Lincoln High School asks, and I've modified it slightly, is common law synonymous with having an unwritten constitution? It sounds like it would be contradictory. Is it?
No, I don't think so. You can have common law with a written constitution, as we do, and as the colonists did. The colonists had the English common law, and they had their charters, which they considered to a great extent their constitutions, so much so that As I mentioned last time, the Connecticut Charter and the Rhode Island Charter are just rolled over, and they got their computers out and did a global search and replace. Let's get rid of the king and supply the people. And so that's what the authority of the charters made into constitutions for those two states now evolved. But these charters were their constitutions, both from the perspective of institutions of government and the different branches of the government. It gave them their representative body that was specified in these charters. It gave them protection of rights, because virtually in every single charter there was the protection of the rights of Englishmen. So the Americans liked these charters, but they also liked the common law, because all these other rights were based upon common law. And they also were deriving their own common law. So New York had its own common law, and Massachusetts had its own common law that was being derived from their colonial existence. And so they're part of a broad package. And you need, however, to fully implement the common law, you need a cadre of lawyers who are trained in the common law and know where to look to find examples. So if a case comes up, where's the precedent for that in common law? And so Americans like the idea of written law, a written constitution, and they have that, as I say, in their colonial charters, then they have it in their revolutionary state constitutions, and then in their national constitution. First of all, starting at the federal level with the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution of 1787. But that's not the only itemization of what their government would be. Many of the rights are embodied in the common law and in the great documents. It was once said of the Constitutional Convention that this was the greatest stroke from a group of people at one time. And that at one time meant, I think it was Gladstone that mentioned that, great English prime minister, to distinguish it from the English system, which was, I'm sure Gladstone thought, was a better example of government than the American Constitution. But it wasn't stricken off at one time. It was over a period of centuries. And that had a method of providing the best of government. And the common law was only one part of that.
Joseph from Brunswick High School asks a question: are there any advantages to not having this an unwritten constitution? Is the flexibility the sole advantage?
Flexibility certainly is an advantage. When you have a written constitution, you maybe can't cover every single example, every single occasion that comes up, and you might have something that is uncovered. So I'll give you perhaps one of the most obvious examples, the Articles of Confederation. It provided that Congress only had those powers that were expressly delegated to it. That was very favorable from the point of view of the Americans fighting against the imperial government and establishing a federal government. They didn't want ambiguous federal powers. Well, what happens when you're governing the territories? There's nothing in the Articles of Confederation that gives Congress the power to govern the territories. The Ordinance of 1785, the Land Ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance. So Madison mentions that these are at best extra-constitutional because the Constitution did not provide for them. And in fact, you had to maybe blink to allow Article 2 to be forgotten, that expressly delegated powers are the only powers that Congress has. So there's no doubt when you have a written Constitution, you're going to have disagreement there. Things won't be black and white. There'll be ambiguity. How do you interpret this provision of the Constitution or that provision? Sometimes there might be provisions of the Constitution that seemingly are inconsistent with each other. Which one takes precedence? And so these are all difficulties with written constitutions. Whereas with the unwritten constitutions, you go back to these laws and the common law and you draw upon it, and you have to make your case then as to, is this applicable? Does your case that you have under consideration fall under what branch of the common law, what consideration, what previous case? And so there's a certain degree of advantage that's there, and a certain rigidity that's not there. One of the dangers of having a written constitution is maybe a provision needs to be amended, and it's not being amended, and so you're living within a constitution that you know is defective, and that has a certain degree of danger. There's a danger in too many amendments, and there's a danger also in allowing the Constitution to be violated. And so written constitutions do have certain problems.
It's often said that England did have a moment to create a written constitution, and that moment would have been the 19 propositions. Would you agree that that was a possible moment for a written constitution? Maybe first, what is it? And was that the moment for a written constitution?
Well, they did write a written constitution, and the 19 propositions served as the foundation for that written constitution. It was called the Instrument of Government. And the Commonwealth period from 1642, say, to 1660, the English were living under a written constitution, which they got rid of the Crown, they got rid of the House of Lords, and the House of Commons almost right away violated the Constitution, the Instrument of Government. And thereupon comes Oliver Cromwell, who had been so successful in defeating Charles I, with Cromwell leading the New Model Army, and he then takes authority from the House of Commons and rules as Lord Protector with an iron fist and with military lieutenants, generals throughout the country. But looking at the 19 propositions, what this was that in 1637, a court ruled that Charles I was within his prerogative rights to lay taxes of poundage and tonnage. These are import duties to derive a revenue all by himself. No approval of Parliament. Parliament indicated it didn't care for this, that these rights, this authority to levy taxes should be done in conjunction with Parliament. And so in the famous case of ship money case, it's called 1637, the court ruled that Parliament, you're wrong. Not only are you wrong, you cannot in the future pass any law that would impinge upon the king exercising his prerogative powers. This, in a way, is sort of a declaratory act, not Parliament against the colonies, but of the king and the courts against Parliament. And so Parliament doesn't care for this and turns around and says that the king acted illegally and the court acted illegally in giving its judgment in the ship money case. So you really have a constitutional crisis on your hands. So what does the king do? He prorogues and dissolves then Parliament. Parliament is not there. Well, it is out of existence for about 3 years. But he needs more money, and so he calls for Parliament to come back. And Parliament then in 1642, June of 1642, it issues what it calls the 19 propositions. And what this will do will eviscerate the monarchy. It will take away most of the prerogative powers. And so it provides that the Privy Council will be nominated and appointed by Parliament, not by the king. The Privy Council majority will be necessary to pass major legislation. The Parliament will be the advisors of the king. The Parliament will provide for the education of the royal children. The Parliament will provide who the royal children marry. The Parliament will decide that Catholic children should be educated under the Church of England. The Parliament decides who will be appointed peers. So the king can no longer on his own appoint lords, both temporal and ecclesiastical. This is one way that the king controlled Parliament. He could create new lords. The king was told, you've got to have closer relations with the Netherlands, the Protestant Netherlands, and opposed to the Catholic countries of Europe and the Pope. And so on and on. There are 19 of these provisions, 19 propositions, that will make the king subject to Parliament. That's what Parliament wants. The king responds quickly saying, no, I will never do such a thing. That's in June of 1642. Within 3 months, the king, who has left London, unfurls his pennant, which is a symbolic way of declaring war against Parliament, and the English Civil War begins. Parliament then, as I said, eliminates the monarchy and eliminates the House of Lords and creates the instrument of government, which is based largely upon the principles of the 19 propositions.
John, you used a word earlier, extra-constitutional. Do I take it that extra-constitutional is different than unconstitutional?
I think so. Every single case doesn't that comes up. There's not always a logical and definitive constitutional handling of that case, and so you have to step out a little bit and use your logic. For instance, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no coercive mechanism that was there. Now, Thomas Jefferson in Paris said, not a problem. All you have to do is send a frigate to the individual states, and if they're not paying their requisitions, there's taxes that the Confederation Congress has laid. You put a blockade up, and that's his method. He says that there's an implied power. If you have the power to tax, you have the implied power to collect. And there is under the Articles of Confederation, there is a supremacy clause, Article 13, that says that the states are obliged to inviolably observe the provisions of the Confederation Congress, the laws that are passed. And so if these states don't, then you have that implied power, Jefferson says, send a frigate. Now, the only problem that Jefferson had with that is that when he wrote that in 1787, he was not aware that Congress had sold its last frigate in 1786. And so there was no frigate to send to do the blockading. And so sometimes, however, you do need to go beyond the letter of what's written in the Constitution. And that might well be considered extra-constitutional. Obviously, the Constitutional Convention. There's nothing in the Articles of Confederation that would allow or disallow a constitutional convention. So this is sort of extra-constitutional. It's not unconstitutional, but it's over and above the provisions of the Constitution.
Some have said that one of the basic differences in the way American colonials thought and the British thought was over this idea of higher law. Was there a difference in how these two groups thought about higher law? And if so, what is the basic difference?
In England, they certainly believed that the higher law was the common law in these great documents, and they looked back upon them. And so that took precedence over the political situations of the time. In America, however, they were feeling that the constitutions that they had, these were the charters, as I mentioned before, but also the state constitutions, these were the higher law and should not be violated. And so both sides believe that there's higher law. there is also, over and above the man-made law, there is the natural laws, natural rights that are there. That is the highest of these laws and these protections. And so, yes, it's a matter of interpreting what is the highest law. And so that could be a written constitution, or it could be common law and a precedent in the form of these great documents that have become institutionalized as protectors of the rights of people.
Let's move to the last section, the second bullet. On the eve of the American Revolution, we see so much of this rights of Englishmen phrase. What does that mean, and is that different? Well, let's ask the first question. What are the rights of Englishmen? It seems to be all over the literature.
Yes, the rights of Englishmen is something that's you're very proud of, and you're grateful that you have, if you're an American. And these rights are embodied in the colonial charters, and it's written as the rights of Englishmen as if we were in the realm. That is, the fact that we migrated from England to this new world, and we're 3,000 miles away, doesn't deny the fact that we have these rights. And these are the rights that we should have, and they are what distinguish the English form of government from other forms of government, particularly at that time, where you have the monarchy on the continent, particularly the French and the Spanish monarchies, which are absolute. Any semblance of popular control, popular representation, done away with. Authority is in the king, the divine right of kings. That's not so in England. The feeling was that Englishmen had more rights than any other people in the world. And it was something to relish and something to be grateful for. And the Americans wanted to have those rights. As time goes on and the Americans sort of get, to use a vernacular, a little too big for their britches, they have this period of benign neglect where they're developing their own rights, and the colonial assemblies are getting more and more independent from the governors, who are often the agents of the royal government, and they're doing things that will promote the interests of the colonies as opposed to the interests of the empire, or more particular, of the islands, the English islands. So the imperial government believes that they must put some restrictions on the colonists, and those restrictions are not just in the form of we should be able to tax them, but we should limit what they're doing. They shouldn't be competitors with British manufacturers and British shopkeepers and British merchants. All of this should be one system. And consequently, you want to take away some of the rights that Englishmen have and say these rights are not applicable to all American colonists. And in fact, what the English develop is that the American rights are given by the king through his grace. And so the Americans don't have these rights because they're Englishmen. They have the rights because they're given those rights by the crown. Americans don't care for that at all. They want the rights of Englishmen. And in their protests, which take the form of petitions over and over again, post-1760, when the new imperial policy is developed and more in greater control over the Americans, these petitions are filled with this language of the rights of Englishmen. We have those same rights going back to Magna Carta, the right to tax ourselves, and that has evolved into the colonial assemblies. That's a right of Englishmen. So not to be taxed by Parliament, the way Englishmen are taxed by Parliament, or Irish are taxed by Parliament, or the Scotland is taxed by Parliament, but because of the geography, we tax ourselves, our assemblies, and we'll cooperate within the system. But these are rights of Englishmen, the right to tax ourselves. And so that's what they want. And the imperial authorities are denigrating those rights, saying, no, you don't have the same rights. And in fact, the rights of representation that you have are to be represented virtually. All Englishmen have, even though some of them do in fact vote for representatives in their shires, they are represented by everybody. All members of Parliament represent all Englishmen, a virtual representation. And that's the way that the imperial authorities are saying to the Americans, you have virtual representation. The Americans are saying, no, we want more than that. We want the rights of Englishmen, the right to elect our own representatives. And we can't do that for Parliament. It's just too far away. So we do that in our assemblies. Now, eventually, they run out of their patience, and these petitions don't have any impact in Parliament or with the King. And so the Americans decide they have to go beyond that, and you add to the rights of Englishmen natural rights. And eventually you go beyond that. The Continental Congress uses that in its one of its last petitions to the Crown, the rights of Englishmen and natural rights. By the time the Declaration of Independence comes along in 1776, no longer are the rights of Englishmen even mentioned. It's now only natural rights.
Do you think that rights are more secure if someone says they're rooted in natural law rather than rights rooted in being given by a government or a king?
There are certain rights that seem to be all-powerful and that individuals should not give up. You have the social compact theory, where individuals are living in a state of nature which can be very difficult, and survival of the fittest. And so the way to safeguard rights is to come together and give government certain powers over individuals, powers that would protect the rights of the weak from the power of the strong. And so the question is what rights are given up. And so the presumption is there are certain natural rights that cannot be touched. The freedom of religion, let's say. People should not be coerced into how they think. The right to freedom, the right to, not necessary to vote, but there are certain natural rights and there's certain civic rights. And so the civic rights are things that you agree should be granted to individuals, whether they be citizens or subjects or aliens. They could be different. And these are subject to the control of the political authorities. And so it's always questionable what rights you might give up as to the rights that are guaranteed by a political body. Whereas the natural rights are God-given, given to you as an individual. Naturally, however, there's an interpretation that gets involved in all of this. What are the natural rights? What rights fall within that category and thus are protected? And then all the other rights are civic rights, which some of those can be given up given the situation that is there. So I would say, in a generic sort of sense, natural rights are more safeguarded. But there's always a question as to who sets those rights. And so one of the great documents in American colonial history is the Massachusetts Body of Liberty. It's written in and adopted on the 10th of December, 1641. That's an important date. I'm not a stickler for dates usually, but I mentioned that date for a particular reason. That is, it's 50 years, about 50 years before the English Bill of Rights, and it's 150 years before the American Bill of Rights. And yet this document has it has a list of rights that include every right in the English Bill of Rights and every right in the U.S. Bill of Rights. And it has other rights. It has rights for women, rights for children, rights for aliens, rights for servants, rights for slaves, rights for animals. You cannot work your horse too hard. You cannot drive your cattle too much. Otherwise, you'd be fined. And so there are all these rights. It's a magnificent document, and it's a document that the Massachusetts folks who are involved in this, they're saying, we want these rights listed because we don't trust our government. We want these rights protected here. But you go to the, and throughout history, this document is referred to as a great monument to the rights of mankind. The problem is that most historians don't go to the last page of the Massachusetts Body of Liberty. And on that last page, there's a list of ecclesiastical crimes that are capital punishment. And so blasphemy, a capital crime. Homosexuality, a capital crime. Bestiality. And there's about a dozen of these crimes that come from out of the Bible that the ministers who are basically heavily in charge of the government in Massachusetts put in as capital punishments. And so natural rights can sometimes be abused, particularly by the clergy who are trying to define what actions you should have to be in compliance with the religion that they're espousing. And so those natural rights might be more limiting here and not so tolerant as we might generally think natural rights are.
Well, thank you for spending some time with us, Dr. Kaminski. We look forward to the next time we gather.
Always a pleasure.